Hello learners. Today's session is for the course BEGC 110 British Literature 19th Century, and we are going to discuss one of the poems mentioned in your syllabus, which is Tennyson's Lady of Shalott. Now, when we think of Lady of Shalott, we know that it's a much anthologized poem and it's prescribed everywhere where one gets to study British literature 19th century, and Tennyson among the triumvirate, the famous triumvirate, Arnold, Browning, and of course Tennyson is part of that triumvirate, and he is also equally popular and much anthologized and a very classical author and poet. So, given the themes of the poem, which is entrapment of a woman in an isolated island, a tower, per se, and then the longing, the, sense of seclusion that she feels, and the dreary song that she sings, and all of that ensues from that particular idea is very much discussed and talked about. On your screen right now, you're looking at one of the paintings that was made by the inspiration of the poem Lady of Shalott. This is the 1888 painting by John William Waterhouse. He painted two other versions also in the year 1894 and 1915. And the second painting, the 1894, and the third one, 1915 one, they basically focused on the lady as she was there in the island, one where she is looking at the knight Lancelot, and the other one where she is actually saying, "I'm half sick of shadows," the famous line, "I'm half sick of shadows," said the Lady of Shalott. So when you particularly look at this painting, you realize the impact that this particular poem has had on the artistic landscape and in the literary culture of the country at that point of time, and how we kind of read this as a part of British literature 19th century. And a while ago I was talking about some of the common themes that are there along the lines with this particular poem is discussed, isolation of women, how this becomes a standardized way, or Lady of Shalott becomes every lady, given the Victorian times and the societal norms that were there to kind of bind them in a particular trap, or the trap of the gender norm, or whatsoever, in general the situation was there for women in the society, and she becomes a kind of a mirror image of all the women that are there, or facing the same kind of situation more or less in their own personal lives. But when we, take a look at, and I would like to kind of, talk about this traditional view. This is what we were talking about. The lady's weaving represents the artistic creativity and vision. This is another view, and this is also a very traditional view of reading the poem, because ultimately the Lady of Shalott is an artist. She's weaving, she's creating something, and the vision that she has in the mirror. And therefore, the weaving becomes a metaphor for the artistic process, which is detached yet deeply reflective. She is detached because she is isolated, in the island. The lady's role is aligning with the themes of solitude and the artistic struggle, where she has to, seclude herself completely and long for the real things that are out there on the other end, on the island of Camelot. So that is again one view, and this, as you can see, is a very ungendered way to look at a poem which has a woman at the center as a central character. So that is one view. And then Sandra Gilbert and Susan Goober, in their very seminal work, The Mad Woman in the Attic, the woman writer in the 19th century literary imagination in 1979, they talk about this and they say that, Lady of Shalott seems like a mad, alienated artist who is stranded on her silent isle, and the lady is as obscure as, because they were talking about in terms of Emily Dickinson's another poems, that's why they are talking about Massachusetts nobody, for who had seen her wave her hand, or at the casement seen her stand, or is she known in all the land, the Lady of Shalott? I mean, these lines they emphasize because they somehow, drape her in anonymity, drape Lady of Shalott in anonymity, and she is anonymous for the entire of the poem. She is so anonymous that she herself doesn't know what name she has. I mean, the final act, when she tries to flow down the river, she inscribes the Lady of Shalott on the board, which is quite ironical. I mean, she has come to terms with the anonymity that was imposed on her, and she has no name. So, I mean, nobody has seen her, and this also this does not only drape her in anonymity. These lines also try to kind of emphasize how she is almost like a mythical figure. And we will talk about that in a while, because when we think of a mythical figure, we are, thinking in terms of how close they become for any sort of interpretation, close in the sense locked they become in terms of interpretation, because myths are usually handed down, myths are usually understood and passed down without any sort of interpretation, conventionally speaking. So this is what Gilbert and Goober, trying to emphasize here. And then they also point out that singing her last song, therefore, she floats herself like mad Ophelia, Hamlet's Ophelia, down the river to Camelot, where she is found lying robed in snowy white, and she becomes a memento mori of female helplessness, aesthetic isolation, and virgin vulnerability carried to deadly extremes. I mean, these words need to be looked at with some sort of significance, where they are talking about how she becomes an example of sort, a reminder of a deadly reminder of female helplessness, that there's a full stop to it and you cannot do anything about your helplessness, and she becomes a deadly reminder of that, because that is how the poem ends in her death. She becomes a negative examples of sorts, like so many other that you have seen in 19th century literature, be it Jane Eyre's Bertha Mason, be it My Last Touches, the Duchess in the My Last Duchess, Browning's My Last Duchess, or any other poem. Women who tried to digress, women who tried to tweak the much established patriarchal gender norms. They were given a punishment of sorts in terms of either their death or the seclusion they have to face, or simply the madness that it seems to be imposed on them. When you read a text like Jane Eyre, you do understand that Bertha Mason's madness is an imposed one, and that if it is not an imposed one, it needs to be questioned how she has come to be declared as a mad woman who stays in the attic all the while. So there are parallels that one can draw between Lady of Shalott and Mad Woman in the Attic, quote-unquote Mad Woman in the Attic, Bertha Mason. So this is what she becomes as an example, Lady of Shalott. But then again, as I was talking about how she becomes a mythic figure, that somehow, stops her from being interpreted, analyzed from different perspectives. And this is the ground that Isabel Armstrong, lays down in her very iconic book, Victorian Poetry, Poetics and Politics, 1993. The book was published in 1993, where she is talking about the closeness, the lockedness of this figure, which has been imposed on this particular figure, and that somehow, remains very difficult for it to be interpreted and leave it open to be analyzed in critical terms. So she lays down that, and then she posits that how it can be analyzed in a different way altogether. We'll talk about that in a while. So you see that Lady of Shalott becomes sort of an archetype of Arachne and Penelope. These are the characters from the Greek myths and tragedies, where these both the women are associated with weaving, the art of weaving, and both of them are somehow weaving under constraint. Where be it Arachne, who is weaving for a competition of sorts and fighting with gods, and Penelope, who's trying to fend off the suitors because she's waiting for her husband, and Echo and Narcissus, who are somehow cursed by gods to view their own reflection or hear themselves, and how isolating that becomes at one point of time. So she is a reflection of all of that. And then, of course, there's a tragic fairy tale which is at the heart of the poem. She's a heroine of a tragic fairy tale because the poem has all the components of a fairy tale. She's a lady sheathed in mystery and living alone in an island, and there's a hero, the knight in the shining armor, Lancelot, with whom she falls in love with just a glance. So largely she's existing in the world of myth and the constructed narratives, around her. So Isabel Armstrong is, trying to, argue over here that okay, fine, she is, a conflation of a number of myths and mythic structures that are around her, and she is sealed off. And this is what I was talking about when I was telling you that she's closed, from any sort of interpretation that can, take the poem in a different direction altogether from the obvious ones. So she's sealed off from the interpretation with all the mysteriousness and inaccessibility of myth, as surely as a lady is sealed in her tower. It's a beautiful way to put it. As a lady is sealed off in her tower, she is also sealed off from any kind of interpretation because she echoes so many myths that are already there. In fact, this poem is basically about poem of longing for sexual love, for change and transformation, which is denied change, her yearning. And that is also for a long time been the interpretation of the poem. So lady becomes a doomed victim and dies a sacrificial death, failing to come into sexuality and language. She is denied the position to have her own agency. She is denied the position, even though she tries. It's a yearning for change, and it is also the poem, the way poem ends, it's also the denial of that change that she is expecting to happen, or is trying to make happen for her. So therefore she becomes a sacrificial figure, therefore she becomes a negative examples of sorts. And this is what Isabel Armstrong has also pointed out, along with Gilbert and Goober, as we have seen a while ago. And this particular idea is also reflected in these lines from the poem, as you can see on your screen. And moving through a mirror clear that hangs before her all the year, shadows of the world appear, and sometimes through the mirror blue, the knights come riding two and two. She hath no loyal knight and true, the Lady of Shalott. The later version, there were two versions of the poem. This is the part of the revision, where it's mentioned that she hath no loyal knight and true. In this particular line, you see that what Isabel Armstrong is pointing out, that this is a poem of longing for sexual love or transformation, and basically longing. So the idea of longing, the sense of longing is very much reflected in this particular line. But in her web she still delights to weave the mirror's magic sides, for often through the silent nights, a funeral with plumes and lights, I mean, all the things that she sees on Camelot that are there. And the most iconic line that brings the crisis within the narrative of the poem, which is, "I am half sick of shadows," said the Lady of Shalott. So now we are going to discuss about something very interesting and a very unique point that Isabel Armstrong, in her interpretation of the poem, brings to the table. I mean, in that particular book, Victorian Poetry, Poetry, Politics and Poetics, she is, talking about two kinds of poems that one can read in Lady of Shalott. One is the expressive poem. We talked about how she is a woman locked in an island, and this is a poem of longing, of pain, of and longing for love, particularly, and how she reflects the larger anxieties that are there, among women who are suffering the same, fate as the Lady of Shalott within their households, within different, structures that the patriarchy has created in the society at that point of time, or all point of time for that matter, at that, at that place. So here she brings to the table this understanding where she says that when one reads a secondary poem, which is the critique of the expressive poem, which is the first poem that happens to be there in Lady of Shalott, you also find the idea of labor and oppression, which is there in the Lady of Shalott. Because she sees there that lady's weaving is symbolic of the industrialized labor. The labor that was employed within the industry and did ceaseless work for, and I quote from here, for all its and she says, Isabel Armstrong says that for all the magical quality, the mythical quality that this particular figure possesses in the poem, she is in fact doing a ceaseless work without escape and without pleasure. It's a ceaseless work, because the moment she will stop doing that work, the curse will fall upon her. That's what she has been told, though she does not know what the curse is. She does not know what will happen if the curse really falls upon her. So there she is, garbed in anonymity. The curse that has been told to her to be fallen upon her is also, obscure. So that kind of, an idea, somehow makes her, a very, very mythical figure. That's what we were talking about a while ago. So this in here, she becomes one with the industrialized labor. And therefore, one can draw parallels of Victorian working class and the woman that she is, and how she is, embroiled in the toil of weaving day and night. I mean, it's very much evident in the poem, if one reads the, text of the poem, that how ceaseless that particular job is. So it seems, here Armstrong is basically, pointing out that it seems that Tennyson is maneuvering together, and it's the most interesting point that one can have while reading this particular poem is where, he's trying to maneuver together constraints working on women in Victorian society and the compulsions working on other forms of labor. The reapers and the Cambridge rick burners reacting to the corn laws that were there, that were placed there in the Parliament, and they were very, exploitative of the common, labor force that was, working in the agrarian society. So they were kind of protesting, the rick burners, they were protesting against these, laws by burning the hays, and that's why they were called, rick burners. So the reapers, the Cambridge rick burners reacting to the corn laws, the starving handloom weavers who were being displaced by new industrial processes, they hover just outside the poem. How? Because you see a striking contrast. There is which is usually interpreted in terms of liveliness and the deadly silence where, lady lives. So there is life, there is a funeral, there is a wedding, there is a market, there are women and men and children and knights and lovers, and everybody is like, passing by. There's this whole, carnival of life that's happening there. That's one way to understand it. But the daily laborers, the, wagers, the agrarian workers, all of them belong to the island of Camelot, which is on the other end from where the lady sees it. And they are, kind of, marginalized. They stay outside the poem because ultimately the text is about this lady, and she is the central figure. So she's trying to draw parallel between the two over here, saying that, they also, these weavers, and they are also being displaced by new industrial processes. And they are new industrial processes. I would like to kind of, take a minute to explain, like, this was the era of industrialization, and in Victorian time, we are looking at the society which was changing from the handmade agrarian way of living and consuming, things for maintaining their, daily life, to a more industrialized one, where people were just machines. And Carlyle has written a wonderful essay on this, proclaiming that if one needs to define the era, the 19th century, by any other, epithet, it would not be philosophical, it will not be devotional, it will not be, any other, term that one can define it, but it would be definitely and most definitely the mechanical age that, one is living in. So 19th century is basically a mechanical age that he has, talked about, and the repercussions of living in a mechanical age and what it will bring. He discusses that in detail. So when we are, talking about the new industrial process and the alienation that is happening, the dispossessment of the people who were valued as workers, who were valued as individual artists, they are now becoming, just hands, because that's what they're using to create something, and being a part of a larger industry that just value them for what they can do and how fast they can, do it. So that kind of alienation, dispossession, the, loss of identity as well, for that matter, that is happening for the labor at large in the, if you look at the socio-economic aspect of how, this society is, how, individuals' identity is being constructed at that point of time, then you understand that the kind of dispossession that they were going through, the alienation that they were going through, is similar to the working class women, or women in general, who were placed in similar position. I'm not talking about the privileged ones, and even when one is talking about the privileged ones, the constraints of patriarchy are working in a different way altogether over there. So yeah, largely the examples are drawn from these two spheres. So they hover outside the poem and become strangely aligned with the imprisoned lady. The possibility of change is explored through her psyche, and she becomes a representation of alienation and work. She is becoming a representation of the alienation that the industrialized labor, the displaced, the mechanized, out of traditional forms of labor individuals are feeling at that point of time. So that is, one interesting way to kind of, look at this particular poem. Now, this is again, Isabel Armstrong's perspective, where she's talking about the curse The curse is, again, it's an obscure one. It's garbed under the same mythical quality that the character of the lady is, garbed with. But when you kind of, look at what curse actually is, it's basically nothing but a symbol of the patriarchal constraints that are working on a woman, not an artist, on a woman, who is being told that if you do this, this will happen. And this is something that you have already seen, and you may come across when you read the poem The Goblin Market by Christina Rossetti, where the example of genie is being told again and again to the quote-unquote, fallen woman who's, in the poem. And there's the scope of her being resurrected, the scope of her being redeemed is being explored and is brought together to its final end, where you see a happy ending to that particular poem, where she is finally inducted back in the respectfully in the society from where she would have been ousted because she fell. But here, because here you don't see that happening. Here in this particular poem, the curse falls upon her and she falls prey to that curse, and therefore this particular curse becomes a representation of the patriarchal constraint. And it gets activated, and this is what Armstrong is also pointing out, when the lady asserts her personal agency. I mean, it's very ironical. The curse remains a untruth of sorts, not a lie, untruth of sorts, which is not realized, which is not very real in very tangible terms for the lady. But as soon as she kind of becomes real, the lady becomes real, she is asserting her personal agency, the curse then becomes real. Till the time she was living in the lie of the curse was also a lie. But as soon as she became truthful to her reality, which is, that the kind of, lack she is going through, which is, kind of the estrangement that she is going through, all of that, when she realizes, the curse also becomes true. So the irony of the situation is that the curse mirrors the tension between duty and self-expression, the duty of an artist, or in other terms, if you want to think about it, it's also working within the constraints that are imposed on you, if that is what duty is in this particular context. And she's torn between that, because the self-expression, the moment you express yourself, you are going to defy your duty, which is again an imposed one. And this is how Isabel Armstrong also thinks about it, and she says that the curse is the myth of power which kept the lady as a subject. But the irony is that the curse comes true at the very moment she redefines her life as a lack. Till that particular moment, she hasn't realized that her life has a lack. I mean, if you read the poem, you'll come across this particular stanza where, she's looking at the island, she is looking at the carnival, the fair, the grand fair of life that is unfolding before her, and she's okay with that. But she is looking at people going by, she's looking at the activities, men, women, children, going by the island, and she's still doing that. So it's only when she couldn't, resist the desire of looking at this, very handsome knight, Lancelot, that where she, expresses her desire for that, particular knight, and she becomes, real in those terms, then the curse somehow, falls upon her. Then she, kind of the attempt to redefine, her life as a lack in terms of her own desire, which was not there, which was activated, at that point of time by the glance that she casts on, Lancelot the knight in the poem. So, I mean, in conclusion, if one wants to kind of, talk about how do we do a second reading of the poem vis-a-vis Isabel's argument, it's very interesting to note how she equalizes, she relates the, isolation, the alienation of this particular woman, the anonymous woman, lady of Shalott in this particular island, and then the anonymity that at large in the society was unfolding and infiltrating the lives of individuals who were otherwise a valued labor. That's one understanding, and how the curse particularly works as a sort of a a symbol of a constraint which is there not on an artist but on a woman, and how she is trying to redefine her life in terms of lack through her desire, and that is somehow foiled by the idea of her death, which is also imposed in a very mysterious way at the end of the poem. So this is how, if you read the poem, this will enrich your understanding, added to what is already explained in your, study materials and everywhere else that you read about this particular poem. And that is all for today. Thank you.